Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. As you probably know, I am in the gaming community and gaming YouTuber, although I am also interested in the finance aspect of the world. It's more of a passion to me, and I'd like to present to you what I believe based on Benjamin Graham and Warren Buffett's ways and others, that investment really is, and how to at least think about it, about how to invest safely for beginners and the like, and for people who just want to live their life, defensive investors. The definition of investment. Investment is an operation that promises safety of invested capital, principal, and an adequate return. Principal, for example, is $100. Maybe you had it in a drawer, in a bank account, and you wanted to put it somewhere, so you chose US Treasuries with a 1-year maturity. The return is 3.83% per year. So at the end of the year is $103.83 or $103.83. So, to recap, not only do you get your principal back, but you also get something over it in return. And it is important to note, as an observation, that any operation not meeting these criteria is considered speculation. Okay, so keep that in mind, please. Any operation not meeting these criteria of promise of safety for invested capital and adequate return is considered speculation. As I see, the inflation is the main driver. As time goes on, for most healthy economies, inflation erodes the purchasing power of a currency. You need more money to buy the same product, or you can buy less product with the same amount of money. For example, the United States dollar has had an inflation rate of 2.9% for the entire year of 2024, which roughly means $100 on the 1st of January 2024 is equal to $102.9 on the 1st of January 2025. Thus, keeping large sums of money at home, on hand, or in non-savings accounts isn't a smart thing unless circumstances demand it. An incoming bill, or rather a large expense which requires you to have that money at that moment, or for reasons of instant liquidity in cases of emergencies. Some people may not be medically insured, so they need a bit of money to afford treatment. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality for a lot of people. Down below we have two graphs: inflation eroding the value of the dollar, meaning how much less $100 from 1914 is at current power, and perhaps something which is more interesting is the buying power equivalent of $100 in 1914. As you can see, it's down here, and it has grown to several dozen times the power, or rather said, decreased in power. You need some 30 something time the amount of money to buy the same thing you could have bought with less in 1914. It's just how things work. We may not enjoy it, but it is a reality that we have to deal with as regular people, me and you. Before we can get into more exact details, we must address the elephant in the room: compounding interest. The curse is that inflation works on the principle of compounding on itself year after year, as I've shown you in the second graph on the last page. The currency gets exponentially weaker with time, not linearly, exponentially, which is an issue. The blessing is that investing generally, and not speculation, and I want to make this very clear, not speculation, makes use of the same principle. Well, what is it? Let's compare it to simple interest first to understand it in context with a simple mental exercise. Suppose you have $100. You lend it to someone you're more empathetic towards on the basis of simple interest at a rate of 10% per year for 3 years. That means that the person will have to pay you back the $100 amount plus 3 times of 10% of $100, which is $130. Simple enough, no? Then you lend the same $100 to someone you personally have a grudge against at the same interest rate per year for 3 years, but this time while compounding. That person will have to pay you back $133.1. Let's take a look at the math, shall we? We have a pretty interesting formula, this one at the top of the screen, where A equals amount to be received after n years, P equals principal or initial investment, R over 100 yearly interest rate in percentages, for example, as we said, 10%, and N is the number of years for the money invested, which in our case is 3. So when you put the numbers down, you can see that 100 is multiplied with 1.1 to the power of 3. Excuse me. It means that 100 is multiplied with 1.331, which is 133.1. As you can see, the difference gets bigger either as time goes on, in the case where you're comparing the same interest rates but on different principles, or with interest rate, because in the mathematical formula, if you increase either the interest rate or the number of years it is applied to, you get massive numbers. You could play around with it and find out how crazy things get the bigger the numbers you put in there, because it is not something linear. So compounding interest is better for you as an investor than simple interest. The two types of investors, as per Benjamin Graham, the first one is the defensive investor. He's the type of investor that wants relatively safe or relatively low risk investments that don't require him to dedicate his life to the field. And most investors, at least 95% or so, are defensive investors. It's nothing wrong to be one, actually. It's advisable to be a humble defensive investor, because such investor can outlast the other people who are maybe too arrogant or too blind by ignorance and greed to make reasonable decisions. So it's better to be humble and limit your expectations to realistic amounts, so that in the future you may be guaranteed to have that result, whereas someone who didn't plan this so thoroughly may end up hating their lives and themselves for the mistakes they've done in the past, especially in their youth. The enterprising investor. He is the type of investor that can dedicate a significant amount of time and effort to his selection of investments after studying investment procedure. He is also more likely to take risks that are unacceptable to the defensive investor, though by virtue of being an investor, he is not a speculator, because his risk is calculated. That's the important word, calculated. It's not an uncalculated risk like putting 100% of your money into a low market cap cryptocurrency, and it's not the same as putting all your money in a sports bet, let's say. Only a handful of investors attempt this route because it is more complicated, there are less guarantees, and the effort to implement is gigantic. Simply put, this isn't something most people can be. Most people actually don't want to dedicate years of grueling effort for something so abstract and so inherently unsafe, when they could enjoy their life, spend more time on things that actually find meaning and purpose, and let their money work for them. So you really have to understand that you can be one or the other, but not both at the same time. Okay? or you can be a speculator, but I'd highly advise against that. So keep that in mind, please. The two standard approaches for the defensive investor, for which I want to put a lot more emphasis on this video, besides getting a house or apartment on a mortgage, which acts both as a living space and long-term capital investment, which is what most people around the world do as their life investment, not just a mere investment, and their implications. First one is the fixed income assets category. Most of the times this means government bonds, like US treasuries, for example, if you live in the USA. They offer a guaranteed return backed by the power and trust of a government, which has its own tools of ensuring payment to creditors, like increasing taxation. In my opinion, these are objectively the best investment tools for the average person. Not only is it extremely safe, but these generally beat inflation. So if inflation is 2.9%, for example, in the USA, treasuries give around 3.83% annual yield if you put them on a 1-year maturity. So it means that even after accounting for inflation, you have more money at the end, guaranteed. So that is why government bonds and the like are so special, so noble, though they are far from the only fixed income asset someone could buy. Savings accounts, while not a security, generally give a lower return than government bonds, with the benefit that you can withdraw your money more easily with fewer penalties. You basically give the bank money to lend to other people, and the bank gives you a small percentage of that in return. It's not great in general, but instead of the money not getting any interest, it's better to at least put them there. And they have certain advantages, but I'll try to keep this simple. Corporate bonds offer greater returns than government bonds in general, with the risk that the corporation won't be able to fulfill its obligations towards its creditors. One of the main advantages of bonds over stocks is that the creditors have priority access to proceeds from bankruptcies. So even in the worst case scenario where the company can't function anymore, you are more likely to recover your principal as a bondholder than as a stockholder. To mention, which is highly important, is that high yield bonds aren't necessarily better investments. A US corporate bond offering 5% interest is generally considered safer than another US corporate bond offering 9% interest. The latter is considered exponentially riskier and called junk, not only because they have to pay more of their money to creditors, and it becomes increasingly difficult the more you have to pay back, but in general, weak companies with weak finances have to finance by offering these higher interest rates to compensate somewhat for the risk. So it is advisable to keep bond investments in the high quality domain, not low quality nor junk, simply because with bonds it's better to be guaranteed of earning less than having the risk of earning nothing. It is a negative selection in the end, but it works. Then we have index funds like the S&P 500. Perhaps, though not without merit, these are highly regarded by most people and institutions alike, maybe too good for their own sake. The idea of index funds is that the average person with limited funds can get exposure to large amounts of companies, forming an index, like the S&P 500, which is also the most popular worldwide, for a small annual fee, around 0.1% or so. It's actually a noble idea, although I believe it's been overused to the point where I wouldn't advise a defensive investor to put the majority of his money into them, perhaps not even more than 40% in current market conditions, for safety reasons, which I will get to immediately. So, to recap, besides working for a house, or better said, to pay a mortgage for a house, there are fixed income assets or index funds. Individual stock selection isn't something I would advise for the average person, and especially for the defensive investor. It is quite hard to do properly, and in general index funds protect you a bit more from your own weaknesses as a retail investor with limited knowledge. So, what's the deal with the S&P 500 index funds? There have been some pros historically. Of course, after World War I and World War II, being unscathed, later coming out on top from the Cold War and initially being a leader in new tech and computing, the US economy has seen a massive growth over the last century, and development barely interrupted by wars. Because they weren't fought on their own soil, recovery was quick and led to even more growth overall. In this light, the US economy has been an investor's best place for most of the last 100 years. Development was guaranteed, and safety of assets was also practically guaranteed. And I say practically because after the USSR invented ballistic missiles, in theory not even US soil was safe anymore. But fortunately it didn't come to that point, so we can now live and talk about how to invest. Americans themselves started relying less and less on Social Security as time went on. Thus demand for such funds to be put in Roth IRAs or 401ks has exploded, thus increasing their price massively on top of the other factors. There's a trend in US finance right now which states that everyone can become a millionaire by simply putting money into index funds without even looking at them. This isn't without any merit, of course. Some people have become millionaires by this method, but I'd be rather cautious on saying this because there are certain cons and certain principles I will want to talk about in the next chapters. Cons. Index funds are, as the name suggests, index. You're buying both the good performance and bad performance on a stock market index. Thus your earnings are limited to what the index provides on average. However, your risk isn't necessarily limited, and this is a problem. A serious stock market crash can wipe out 90% or more, probably less, of the value of stocks. Even after considering a quick stop to value drop, it could take years or decades for the amount to raise back up to where it started from, and most people wouldn't keep their money there after losing it, because it's a psychological thing. Most people can handle such big shocks, such big wipeouts of wealth and prosperity. So in such instances, I think most people not only wouldn't make their money back after a stock market crash, but they might eat up all of their losses. They might have worked years and years to gain enough money to buy those index fund shares, and their value was practically deleted overnight in this hypothetical market crash. Compared to the late 80s and early 90s, the US S&P 500 index has grown tremendously, outpacing earnings growth in most sectors. This can be a symptom of the formation of an economic bubble, where earnings grow too, but at a lesser rate than the price of those securities, or rather said stocks. At one point, it becomes problematic, to say the least. More and more Americans and foreigners are investing in S&P 500 index funds as part of pension plans or otherwise. Thus, in the short and medium term, my forecast is that the index will continue to do well until the bubble bursts at an unknown time. That may be in 10 years, 15, 25, maybe in 100, we can't know for sure. But there are certain symptoms, and I want everyone listening to be careful in regards to that. The law of diminishing returns. Everything that grows on an exponential basis in the real finite world is governed by this to some extent or another. Not just in finance, but also in sports, the mastery of a field, like driving, cooking. At first, you're making a lot of progress relative to the beginning, but as time goes on, the progress seems to diminish, unless you keep adding increasingly more time and effort for that, which is impossible to do forever. For example, you can't add 1 hour of practicing the guitar forever. There are only 24 hours in a day, of which you need at least 8 hours of sleep. So at the very most, which is highly impractical, you could practice for 16 hours. So there comes a point where diminishing returns must set in. There is no other way. In the case of the S&P 500 index, it is around or almost at the point of maximum yield, in my opinion. Somewhere around here or here or here. Revenues have kept growing overall, but slower than the price and the massive demand for such funds, which is how I base my judgment. Not on emotions, not on hype, on pure facts. Facts of nature, facts of market, valuations, etc. As such, while I don't want to break anyone's dream of owning a Ferrari at 60, which is kind of cool, don't get me wrong, we must be realistic in assessing the core element that differs investment from speculation, which is risk. I'm not saying you shouldn't own it, but I will try to explain how I advise the average investor to go about it. And of course, while economic factors, new technology and so on can prolong the duration of each phase, such as the increasing returns phase, the diminishing returns or negative returns, eventually, probably sooner than later, comes the point where returns diminish too much. Diversification. Is it misunderstood? What diversification is? It is distributing your portfolio, money invested, into several assets of different nature. Some into bonds, some into stocks, some into real estate, maybe even a bit into crypto if there is a bit of speculative appetite, especially for higher income individuals like doctors or lawyers who can afford such thing. This ensures that you benefit a little bit from the different advantages of different classes of assets. What it isn't, buying only S&P 500 index funds or only giant tech companies. You need to hedge against market risk and fluctuations, not by putting all your money in the same pot, so to say. It matters tremendously. While all markets are interconnected, they are affected disproportionately by specific conditions. For example, if the stock market goes down 50%, the real estate market may have gone down only 30%, and the bond market only 20%, or vice versa. We can't really know. But it is true in general that markets are affected disproportionately by different crises. Proposed structure for diversification. I intend to keep this presentation as short as I can, and I also have to mention the fact that while I personally recommend this based on behaviors and mathematical data I know, it shouldn't sound like I'm forcing anyone to adopt the following structure, A, B or C. My intention is just to give you, as the curious viewer, the best interpretation in my eyes. And while the title does say how to invest, the whole presentation is more on how you can think about investing as philosophy, not actual techniques or in-depth analysis. I may do such a video at some point in the future, although I think a philosophy has to be laid down until deeper things can be discussed. I'll be using percentages of the quote-unquote investment fund, which means the monthly portion of income someone can allocate for investing. So if you earn $3,000 after taxes per month, maybe your investment fund is 1/3 of that, which would translate into $1,000. Different people can allocate different portions of income, some more, some less. It's highly personal and dependent on living expenses, rent, etc. Perhaps even more important than investment philosophy is the income of a person that he or she has from the job, which is a separate discussion, of course. The more income you have, the more you can invest comfortably. So while paradoxically we're discussing about investment philosophy, what maybe is even more important is the amount of money you can generate every month from your job, and thus be able to comfortably invest and make more of it. And I have three main approaches. Of course, these aren't the only ones which can exist, but I like these three ones for specific reasons. A. The ultra-safe securities approach, accessible for investors who care about capital preservation at all costs. 80% government bonds, US treasuries if you live in the USA, and 20% index funds. And as much as I refrain from being overly positive about the S&P 500 index, it still seems good enough for diversification purposes and growth, at least in the medium term. The defensive growth approach, accessible for defensive investors who believe in market conditions. This approach is more focused on the investors which, for their own reasons, believe that the index funds and general market conditions of a country aren't bad, and thus they can put more of their fund into them for expected higher growth returns. And 10% in cryptocurrency, even though it's not an investment, it's a bit more speculation. I left that in there to emphasize the growth aspect, and the defensive nature is given by the 50% government bonds share, which means that at least 50% of your money is guaranteed, no matter what. And the third approach, C, the real estate enjoyer approach, accessible for individuals with relatively high incomes, such as doctors or lawyers, or for those who just don't want to pay rent but instead own their living space. 75% would be the mortgage payment. You want to get rid of that as fast as possible, or house renovations, gradual building of a house. But the discussion on mortgages is a fundamentally different one, which requires a lot of care and thought. Some would not even use it as a living space, which makes renting and thus paying a mortgage easier. But even for relatively rich people, the real estate they buy is their home, not just a monetary investment, but also an emotional one, which separates them from other categories of investments which seem a lot more impersonal or just numbers on a screen, for example index funds. Speaking of them, 15% allocated for index funds, preferably used to help with the mortgage payment as they grow, and 5% in government bonds, a small coupon on top of capital preservation, can help with making an emergency fund so you don't miss mortgage payments while switching jobs or other adverse conditions at work, etc. And 5% in cryptocurrency. It is important. If it does 10x in value in a few years, it could really help with the mortgage payment, thus leaving you with a genuine asset. But if it loses value or doesn't gain that much, it's not a big deal. It's not like it's a big portion of your capital, but it's enough so that it could help you in some time, and if luck is on your side. And before ending the presentation, I want to emphasize that luck is important in investing. Anyone who says luck isn't important is lying through their own teeth, because the luck is the most unpredictable element of investing. No matter how good you are at it or how much you studied, if you are lucky, you can outperform even the best fund managers for some time at least. Be careful out there. Money doesn't grow on trees. Thank you for the attention, and I hope you found this video useful. If you enjoyed it, perhaps you can leave a like, share and subscribe, and consider following me for more. Thank you.